Welcome to the Arts and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall, starring A.M. Hall. Now, here is A.M. Hall.
Welcome to Art and Oddities with A.M. Hall, where I talk about anything that strikes my fancy, to include all kinds of creative works, from children's cartoons to underground zines, to identity politics and everything in between. My guests and I will discuss how art impacts and reflects culture and counterculture, enables individualism and conformity, and have loads of fun along the way. I am your host, A.M. Hall, aka Anthony Bonafini, aka Galena Storm, aka Aquaces Mancuso. This week, in celebration of reaching our 10th episode, we're gonna have a barbecue! Woo, summertime! Then, in part 2, we remember that summertime is summer reading season. So, in summary, I interview local writer Jen Donahue. It's gonna be a hot episode. Stay tuned for the rest of the show. So apparently I started this podcast at a very odd time in my life. I started the podcast at almost exactly the same time that I started on a gigantic summer project. Most of the time I have little things going on, but it seems like in the podcast, in these opening segments where I normally tell you what I've been working on, the only thing I've ever been telling you about is about the film The Trial of Hephaestus that Evie and I are putting on together. It's an overwhelming project, and if you'd met me, you'd think, film this, film that. It's all I talk about. Film, film, film. And I started it right around the same time that I started this podcast. And Evie's doing almost 3 times the work that I am. It's really tough on all of us. Most of the time I have little things to talk about. Most of the time I can tell you, oh, I've been making a hat, or oh, I've been making a shirt, or anything else that I may have been doing. Hey, I've been starting a podcast. But it's hard. It's physically hard on me and Evie, and it's physically hard on our actors too. And it's mentally exhausting too, because the film is all I talk about, all I think about. Making the props for the film, making the costumes for the film, coming up with the call sheet for the film. It's all I'm thinking about right now. And it's taking up all of our free time, and it's taking up all of our friends' free time. We're not paying our actors. We just cast all of our friends in the roles, and they said, that sounds like an awesome project, and jumped on board. So the fact that we are working this hard on it, and our actors are working this hard on it, it's very, very important to plan a break for our artists, for our actors. So one of the things we did recently is we had a barbecue. We had a barbecue in the park. After a solid day of filming, we just took a bunch of food, took a bunch of charcoal to the park. We dumped the charcoal in one of those, barbecue things that they have there in the park for free to use, and we just cooked up a bunch of hot dogs, we cooked up some turkey burgers, and we had a blast. And that was one of the most important things we could have done. Almost every single day after filming, Evie and I are absolutely sure to tell our actors, you did a great job. We are so thankful to you for doing this. And thank you for being our friends. Thank you for being in this project with us. It's important to let them know how much we appreciate them. And the moral of the story is work hard, play hard. Make sure you plan breaks that are appropriate to the level of work that you have done. If it wears you out, if you're stressed out, make sure to have something, like a cookout, like a barbecue, with your friends that have all been working hard with you, and make sure that they know that they are appreciated. Make sure they know that you know how hard they are working. It's very easy when someone is not paid for their work to become resentful, but we like to think that this is a fun project. All of our actors are telling us that they are having fun, but it is work. It's not like playing a video game. We have to plan out every move and physically go out to the locations and do them. Do you know an artist who thrives on appreciation? Is there a fanfic author that you really like? Send them a little note that says, hey, I really like your work. Is there an artist online that you really like? Reblog their work. Share it with more people. It's important. It's important to let them know that they are appreciated. And if you can throw them a buck or two, I'm sure they'd appreciate that too. Again, we're not paying our actors, but we did buy them a bunch of food for the cookout, here have a hot dog, here have a turkey burger. It's whatever you can do. Whatever you can do, like physical gestures like that, are appreciated even more than words. Work hard, play hard, and appreciate your fellow artists.
Oh, excuse me. This is Reverend Panic Evelyn Bedlam, Evie for short. And before we get on with the rest of the show, let me remind all the listeners that podcasts are art too. And if you want to help support this podcast and help us improve, we do have a Patreon. And we do have many other artists on this show, so if you would like to find out where to support them, stay tuned to the credits at the end of the show. We always try to give as much information as how to help them out as possible there. Now that I'm done with our gratuitous plug, back to you, Anthony.
All right, let's go on to the rest of the show. All right, I am here today with local writer Jen Donahue. How you doing today?
Good, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Now, Jen, you and I have been circling each other for years now, but we finally officially met last year. It was actually at one of Evie's gallery shows, wasn't it?
It was, and it is the only opening I have ever shown up for, actually. So it's kind of unique that I then finally met you there, because I'd heard about you a lot too.
Yeah, we'd been circling each other, like I said.
Yes.
I didn't recognize you at the time, but it was something about your manner of speech and your vocabulary that made me realize, oh, you're Evie's writer friend.
Oh. Well, that's fine.
So yeah, you definitely have a writer vibe about you. Your vocabulary and just your mannerisms.
Yeah, well, I have put as many books in my head for as long as I could, so that's where a lot of my vocabulary comes from, and that's where my writing also eventually came from.
So, you do have a very unique voice. Can you tell me about what inspires your unique voice?
Well, I read a lot of classics as a kid.
Okay.
Like somebody gave me a box of children's illustrated classics, and I read, Black Beauty, and the horse thing was really big for me as a kid for a really long time. And Sherlock Holmes and Charles Dickens. But then I also watched a lot of TV. So some of the first things I wrote were episodes for the Ghostbusters television show that I recorded on my dad's boombox. And I also wrote a terrible fantasy novel when I was like 13 that will never see the light of day.
Everything we wrote when we were 13 is terrible. I mean, come on.
That's also true, but my statement stands.
Okay. And I did read a few of your stories before the show today just to get your voice into my head, and I didn't read them all, but I haven't read one that I didn't like.
Oh, well, thank you. Every writer loves hearing that.
I did notice that you write a lot of genre fiction. What types of genres do you tend to write?
I write science fiction and fantasy. I mean, those are the, big monoliths of genre fiction. But I also write kind of weirdly within those genres, because I'm not necessarily writing super hard science, rockets to the moon sci-fi. And I'm not necessarily always writing dragons and sorcerers and magic fantasy. So frequently I'm writing kind of in between the cracks. Like I'm writing, this could happen conceivably in the next 50 years sci-fi, or well, everything looks normal until you realize there's magic going on, fantasy.
Oh, wow. Okay. I did notice that you tend to have very deep and interesting themes going on. Do you tend to write your themes into your genres, or do you write genres to your themes, or do you have a different method?
I frequently don't think of the themes as I'm doing the first draft.
Okay.
Sometimes I always say that I write to see what happens. Like I have this idea that I then follow down the rabbit hole, I guess.
Okay.
And then in rewrites, I'm like, oh, well, I could put this reference in there to show everybody how smart I am. Or, hey, I used this thing, which is actually really cool and works well. I should emphasize that.
I once heard a very good story about Isaac Asimov, actually, where he was attending a lecture about his own work, and they were deep analyzing it, and Isaac Asimov is standing here saying, I didn't do any of that intentionally, you know that, right? And the lecturer turned to him and said, what do you know? You're just the author. Isaac Asimov.
To say that to Asimov with a straight face. But that's a very authorial intent is one of those topics that I have, on one hand, had very strong opinions about, because sometimes there are things it's like that, yes, this is exactly how I mean this.
Mm-hmm.
Don't misunderstand me, this is what this is supposed to mean. But then on the other hand, if somebody reads something I hadn't necessarily intended into my story and it helps them in some way instead of makes them angry on the internet, then who am I to say, no, you can't think that? Like, I'm not the thought police, I just made the words.
Yeah. Once it leaves your page.
Yeah, once it leaves my page, it's kind of out in the world, and that's kind of the scary part about it.
I did notice one of the themes you tend to write a lot about is the subversion of death, or writing about death. Now, where does that come from?
It could come from a couple places. I was raised Catholic, and unlike a lot of people I've met, I never had bad experiences from that. When I visit my grandparents, I still go to church with them on Sunday. You know, I was confirmed in the Catholic Church, all that stuff. Most of the time, I don't go to church here because I'm lazy. But so there is, you know, just ingrained in the church, Jesus died, he came back, so that we wouldn't die forever, essentially. Like there's always that theme in Catholicism. So there's that on one hand, but I'm not necessarily writing Christian stories. I think Christian magazines would be upset if I were to send them some of my stories. Um,
There's at least one where there's a body swapper.
yes, and that's
And as soon as she swaps bodies, she kills the old one. I think it wasn't 100% clear, but I think it was implied.
well, I don't want to confirm or deny what happened to the old body, but again, that's reader interpretation.
But again, that's I think not just a subversion of death, but a subversion of aging too.
Yes, and I think that's possibly where a lot of my other quote unquote death writing comes from. In 2008, my dad died in a motorcycle accident, and he was very young when he had me, so he was very young when he died. And getting older was always something he was a little weirded out by, I think, because when you're young, it's like, wait, I'm going to become an old person? That's really weird. And I think I've got a lot of that from him. So in a way, in that story, it's kind of like, I don't want to be old, so I'll fix it. And it's been, years enough that I think a lot of the writing I do is processing some of that, handling the impossibility of sudden death in one's life.
You have one where there's a soldier who may or may not be still in the war.
Yes. Yes, that's my most recently published one. And actually, the title used to be a dead giveaway of the twist, because everybody tells me, "Oh, I read the story and I really saw the twist, but I was still, really impacted at the end."
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I'm not M. Night Shyamalan. I'm not here to bury the lead.
I'm really glad you changed the title then, because I wasn't anticipating the twist at all.
That's good. See, and then that's good too, because I did want it to be a surprise, but some people, they figure out the twist, they're like, okay, I'm done. Other people, they say, well, I want to see how this happens.
Yeah.
And then other people read a story to see how it goes. I never look for a twist as I'm reading necessarily, or watch a movie to find, to figure it out. I want the story to be told to me.
Yeah, I fall into that camp too. Sometimes I kind of figure things out just because, but I'm not really looking to figure things out.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I am told that you play a lot of role-playing games.
I do play a lot.
You and I have not played together.
We haven't.
But we have played some of the same games, like we played Dungeons and Dragons, I'm sure.
Yes.
I notice a disproportionate number of creative types do play RPGs.
Yes, I think that's true.
How does playing these games help inspire your writing?
Well, I came to D&D, role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons, a little later than a lot of the people I play with, actually. It wasn't until college that I even found out it existed. And when I did, I was unbelievably excited because this was a book you could play in with your friends, essentially. You had a character you're in charge of, and you're writing a story with the people you're sitting down with, and that was amazing to me, and is amazing to me, because you know what your character's going to do, typically. Sometimes you surprise yourself, but you don't know what those other people are going to do. And that's really surprising sometimes.
And all you can do is react.
Exactly. Yeah, you could try to plan, maybe, but yeah, you react.
You have a story it's not labeled as being a D&D story, but it's very clearly a D&D story.
Yes.
And it's not too big of a twist at the end. It's a very short story, but it's...
Yeah, it is a very straightforward, this is, a person in, chainmail armor with a big sword who goes to kill a dragon. That is pretty cut and dry, and it wasn't one of my characters. I know sometimes that's an issue with magazines. They're like, please, for the love of God, do not send us a story that is your Dungeons and Dragons character.
Okay, I can sort of understand why they would say that, but on the other hand, where else are your stories about D&D going to come from?
Well, exactly. So you just want to be like, well, don't worry, I'm not that kind of gamer. Or you want to make it so that you don't need to know about the game
Okay.
in order to understand the story. You don't have to have a stat block for the dragon to be like, okay, dragons breathe fire and have wings and eat people.
Mostly they're sheep, and that's why the people hate them.
Yes, people need their sheep.
All right. I did notice you also have some feminist themes going on. Do you have at least one where there's a male character who tries to one-up a female protagonist, much to his chagrin at the end?
Yes, and I think feminism isn't necessarily something I thought about very much in my writing until more recently. The Dragon story was actually published in a feminist anthology because it never occurred to me in my life or growing up that women were anything less. That women were not women, and then surprise, they're also people. It's, women are capable, women have thoughts and motivations and ideas and accomplish things, and that's just my reality.
Yeah. And each one is an individual versus women being this monolith.
Yes.
Which
Yes,
I think a lot of men struggle with that specifically.
I think so too. I think that there are a lot of walls that people build up around each other and around gender and capability and things like that, and they should really just look for windows.
Oh, that's interesting. Is there anything you're currently working on that you're excited about?
Yes, actually, I have the first 2 books in a werewolf trilogy written.
Oh.
And once the 3rd one is written, I intend to edit and rewrite all 3 of them so that they all agree with each other. This is important.
Oh, yes.
And then I will probably self-publish those on Amazon, actually.
Okay.
So a lot of agents and a lot of editors still say that werewolves are a dead genre. They just don't want them, and I don't necessarily...
Where did they get that in their head?
Markets can get very saturated, and they can get very saturated with the same things as people try to write to the market.
Right.
And they get tired of seeing the same crap.
I guess so.
I can understand.
But again, if it's part of the zeitgeist, then why not, that's where it came from out of your head, right?
Kind of. To a degree. I have read a lot of those books, obviously, current urban fantasy books that have werewolves in them, and I wanted my werewolves to be different. I wanted their behavior to actually be wolf behavior to a degree, and I wanted it to be about families because that's sort of how wolves operate as opposed to how a lot of these books represent them.
Okay. So, did you do some studying on wolf behavior?
I have. Probably not enough necessarily, but there's always time in edits. But I've read a lot about dog behavior. Some of that translates.
Some of it.
Some of it. And I have read about, wolves observed in the wild behavior, which I think is more significant than this is how a wolf in a zoo or in a sanctuary acts.
Right. That makes sense. If any of my listeners wanted to read more of your stories or find out more about you, where would they go?
Well, on my blog, I do have a link to where all the stories have been published, which includes daily science fiction. That was actually my first sale, which was a very, very short story. But the feminist anthology was Mosaics 2. Syntax and Salt published my most recent story.
Okay. I will put a link to your blog in the show notes, but do you want to spell it out for my listeners?
Yes, the blog is authorizedmusings.blogspot.com.
All right. authorizedmusings.blogspot.com. We've been talking for almost 15 minutes now. I think we can probably wrap things up.
All right.
This is Jen Donahue. Thank you for joining me on my podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
All right, really do check out Jen's stories as they are absolutely wonderful. Please stay tuned as we wrap up with the credits. Thanks for listening to the Art and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall. That's our show for today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes. Help make it easier for others to find. I have a new and improved URL to the iTunes page. It's tiny.cc/amhall. Or if you're listening via YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe. Remember, nearly every guest I have has an online presence. I always plug them in the credits, but I also have the links to their works in the show notes, available at panicbedlam.com/podcast. Today's guest, Jen Donahue, has a blog at authorizedmusings.blogspot.com. There you'll find links to where her works have been published. The production and editing of this podcast has been provided by Reverend Panic Evlan Bedlam, and without her it would not exist. If you'd like to support this podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/panicbedlam. That's PANIKBEDLAM. As we produce more shows, we will be putting more content on Patreon exclusively for patrons. You can also help Panic by buying her books, to include a physical copy of The Trial of Hephaestus on lulu.com, or one of her 2 tarot decks available at thegamecrafter.com. You can find them by searching Panic Bedlam on either site. Links will be available in the show notes. Our theme music, Doxel Dance in Space-Time, or Belial and His 7 Wives, was composed and performed by Kion Huru Orion, or as I know him, Michael. Thanks, Michael. If you'd like to contact the show with comments or suggestions, you can email us at artodditiespodcast@gmail.com. Next week, I'll talk about delving for curios on a flea market trip I had with E.W. Motomac. And, more curious than curios, Evie and I plunge the mysteries of their Blood Trillium tarot deck. I can hardly wait. That about wraps it up. Remember, the highest form of magic is doing, and expressing yourself is art. This is A.M. Hall, signing off.